Trisha was the queen of Lagos nightlife, a goddess of luxury, and the face of social media perfection. She had everything: beauty, wealth, and influence. Her Instagram feed was a gallery of extravagance: designer bags, champagne toasts, first-class flights, and penthouse views. She lived in a breathtaking apartment in Banana Island, where the air smelled of money, and the ocean waves whispered to her every morning. Her days were filled with shopping sprees, spa treatments, and brunches in the most exclusive restaurants, while her nights were a blur of flashing lights, loud music, and bottles of the finest champagne. She walked into clubs like royalty, her designer heels clicking against marble floors as men turned their heads, desperate for her attention. Women envied her, influencers wanted to be her, and brands begged for her endorsement. She had mastered the art of living without responsibility, floating through life with no consequences. Trisha loved the thrill of the high life, the way people worshipped her presence. She never worried about tomorrow, never cared about anything beyond the next party, the next viral post, the next expensive gift from a desperate admirer. She was used to getting what she wanted without ever having to work for it. Everything was effortless. Everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. One reckless night changed everything. It was an exclusive yacht party, the kind only the elite could attend. The music was loud, the drinks endless, and the night electric with energy. One moment of carelessness, a little too much champagne, and the blurred face of a man she barely remembered. That was all it took. Weeks later, Trisha found herself standing in her marble bathroom, staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. Her heart pounded in her chest as she shook the test, hoping the result would change. It didn't. She took another one. And another. They all said the same thing. Pregnant. Her perfect life shattered in an instant. She refused to believe it. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't part of the plan. She had built her brand on perfection, on beauty, on being untouchable. Baby? A helpless, crying, needy child? It would destroy everything she had worked for. No more late-night parties. No more designer outfits that hugged her perfect figure. No more traveling on a whim. This baby was a curse. A mistake. A burden she had to get rid of. Panic gripped her. She considered every option. But it was too late for an abortion, and she couldn't bear the thought of anyone knowing. The whispers had already started. People were noticing the changes, the slight roundness of her belly, the way her pictures became carefully cropped. Invitations to elite gatherings became fewer, brand deals slowed down, and for the first time in years she felt like she was losing control. She had to act fast. She had to erase this mistake before it ruined her. The night was cold when she made her decision. The city was asleep, the streets quiet except for the occasional passing car. She wrapped the baby, a tiny, fragile boy, in an old rag. Her hands trembled as she picked him up. He was so small, so helpless. For a brief second, something inside her hesitated. But then she forced herself to remember what was at stake. Her life. Her status. Her freedom. She couldn't let this child ruin her future. Slipping out of her penthouse, she moved quickly through the shadows, avoiding security cameras and nosy neighbors. Her driver assumed she was taking out old clothes, nothing unusual. If only he knew. She walked briskly toward a luxury shopping mall, her heart beat loud in her ears. The trash bins sat in a dark, quiet corner where no one would notice right away. Perfect. She placed the baby inside, stepping back as if he would explode. He wiggled slightly, his tiny face scrunching up. Then a weak cry. A soft, pitiful sound that made something twist in her chest. She clenched her fists. No second thoughts. No regrets. She turned on her heels and walked away, leaving behind the child she refused to love. As she disappeared into the night, she told herself it was over. The burden was gone. She was free. The night was quiet, the streets bathed in a dim glow from the streetlights, and the world felt eerily still. Mrs. Mary Williams, one of the wealthiest women in Lagos, had just finished a late-night business meeting. Her chauffeur was driving her home when she suddenly felt an odd sensation, a deep, unexplainable pull in her chest. It was as if something or someone was calling out to her. She wasn't a woman who believed in omens, but that night, something felt different. As they approached the luxury shopping mall, a faint sound drifted through the air. At first she thought it was a cat or the wind playing tricks on her ears. But as they slowed down at a red light, she heard it again. A cry. A soft, pitiful wail so we could barely cut through the noise of the city. "Stop the car," she said suddenly. Her driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, confused. "Madam." "I said stop the car," she repeated, her voice firm. The car rolled to a stop near the bins lined up beside them all. Mrs. Mary pushed the door open, stepping out into the cool night air. The moment her feet touched the ground, she knew she wasn't imagining it. The crying was real. It was coming from the trash. Her heart pounded as she rushed towards the sound, her heels clicking against the pavement. She reached the bin, the large metal container that held discarded waste from the mall's expensive stores. A horrible feeling twisted in her stomach as she hesitated, afraid of what she might find. With a deep breath, she reached inside, her fingers trembling as they touched something soft. A cloth. No, not just a cloth, something wrapped inside it. She carefully pulled it out, her breath catching in her throat when she saw what lay in her hands. A baby. A newborn baby, tiny and fragile, his skin cold, his breath shallow. Mrs. Mary gasped, pressing the baby against her chest as if to warm him with her own body heat. He was barely alive. His cries were weak, his movements slow, his little face wrinkled in discomfort. It was clear he had been left there for hours, abandoned to die. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Who could do such a thing?" She turned towards her driver, her voice sharp and urgent. "Take me to the hospital. Now." The man nodded quickly, opening the car door for her as she climbed inside, holding the baby as delicately as possible. As they sped through the streets of Lagos, Mrs. Mary kept her eyes on the tiny child in her arms. "Hold on, little one," she whispered. "You're not dying tonight." At the hospital, the doctors and nurses moved swiftly, taking the baby from her arms and rushing him into emergency care. Mrs. Mary stood in the hallway, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her heart thudding with worry. "Madam," a doctor finally approached her after what felt like an eternity. The baby was severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure. "But he's stable now." Mrs. Mary let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief washed over her. "He's lucky you found him when you did," the doctor continued. "Another hour in that cold and he wouldn't have made it." Mrs. Mary's hands clenched at her sides. Anger burned in her chest. How could someone be so heartless? How could a mother carry a child for 9 months, bring him into the world and then throw him away like garbage? It made her sick. She walked into the hospital room where the baby lay in an incubator, wrapped in soft blankets, his tiny body looking so fragile yet so full of life. She gazed at him, a deep, unfamiliar emotion swirling inside her. She had spent her life building an empire, making money, growing her businesses. She had everything, a fortune, power, influence. But she had never been a mother. She had never married, never had children. It was a choice she had made, believing love was a weakness, that emotions distracted from success. But as she stood there, staring at the helpless baby, something inside her shifted. He had no one. He was unwanted, abandoned. But not anymore. Mrs. Mary made a decision right there and then. She wasn't going to let this child grow up in an orphanage or be passed from foster home to foster home. She was going to raise him as her own. Meanwhile, across the city, Tricia slept peacefully in her luxury penthouse, convinced she was finally free. Convinced that the past was behind her. She had no idea that fate had other plans. The hospital smelled of antiseptic, cold and sterile, but the tiny baby inside the incubator was warm and safe. His breathing had stabilized and his small fingers twitched in his sleep. Mrs. Mary sat beside him, watching every little movement, her heart heavier than she could explain. She had built her entire life on logic, on strategy, on things that made sense. This didn't make sense. She had never considered herself the motherly type. But here she was, sitting in a hospital room with a child she had found in a trash bin, feeling a responsibility she never thought she was capable of. The doctors came in to check on him every few hours, speaking in soft voices, carefully adjusting the 4-line in his tiny arm. They told her he was lucky. That most abandoned babies didn't survive. That he had been found just in time. But what kind of life had he been born into? A life where his own mother had seen him as nothing more than an inconvenience, something to be discarded like unwanted leftovers. Mrs. Mary clenched her fists at the thought. She had seen many things in her lifetime, greed, betrayal, corruption, but this was different. This was pure, heartless abandonment. and it left a bitter taste in her mouth. She wanted to know who had done this. She wanted to find the woman who had carried this child for 9 months only to throw him away. But at the same time she knew it didn't matter. The mother had made her choice. Now Mrs. Mary was making hers. By morning the baby was stable enough to be held, and when the nurse placed him in her arms, something inside her shifted permanently. He was so small, so fragile, yet he fit perfectly in her embrace. His tiny fingers curled slightly, reaching out without knowing who or what he was touching. Mrs. Mary swallowed against the lump in her throat. She had never needed anyone in her life. She had built herself from the ground up, made her wealth through ruthless business deals, never letting emotions cloud her judgment. But now, holding this child, she knew she was never letting him go. She finalized the adoption within weeks. With her wealth and influence, the process was smooth, barely any hurdles. Money solved problems, and she had more than enough to clear every obstacle in her way. The name on his birth certificate was changed. He was no longer just another abandoned baby. He was now Nathaniel Williams, son of one of the most powerful women in Lagos. Nathaniel's life from that moment was nothing short of a dream. He grew up in mansions with gold-plated staircases, surrounded by every luxury money could buy. He had the best nannies, the finest tutors, and access to the most elite schools in the country. His mother, despite her demanding business empire, made sure he never lacked love. She didn't spoil him, didn't raise him to be just another privileged rich boy. No, Nathaniel was taught discipline, kindness, and the importance of power. Not just financial power, but the kind of power that came from knowing your worth. Even as a child, he had a sharp mind, excelling in school, impressing teachers with his intelligence. He was raised to be a leader, to think ahead, to command respect. Mrs. Mary was proud of him, more than she had ever been of anything she had built in her empire. But she never told him the truth. To Nathaniel, she was his mother, the only mother he had ever known. And for years the past remained buried, a secret locked away, forgotten. Meanwhile, across Lagos, Trisha had wiped the entire incident from her memory. She continued her glamorous life, acting as if nothing had ever happened. She attended exclusive parties, signed brand deals, and flaunted her beauty on social media. She convinced herself she had made the right choice. She had sacrificed a mistake to save her future. And it had worked. For years she thrived. Men still worshipped her. Women still envied her. Money still flowed into her accounts effortlessly. She was living the life she had always dreamed of, free of burdens, free of responsibilities. But life had a way of balancing the scales. Fate was patient. And it was waiting. Years passed and Lagos changed. New influencers rose. New faces took over the spotlight. Slowly, Trisha's relevance began to fade. She wasn't as young as she once was. The brands that once chased her now looked for fresher, younger women. The men who once adored her found new distractions. Her lifestyle, once effortless, began to demand more. She had to work harder for attention, had to fake more, lie more, pretend more. And slowly the cracks began to show. It started with financial struggles. A bad investment here, a loss there, a brand deal that didn't go through. Then came the betrayals, friends she had trusted suddenly vanishing when she needed them. The industry that had once worshipped her now barely noticed her. She was no longer the it girl of Lagos. She was just another fading socialite struggling to stay relevant. Then the real downfall came. Scandal. A leaked video. A brand that pulled out of a ~1 million deal. The final blow that sent her spiraling into financial ruin. The money was gone. The luxury penthouse was taken. The designer clothes were sold piece by piece until there was nothing left. Her so-called friends disappeared. The men who once threw gifts at her now ignored her calls. And just like that, Trisha went from slay queen to nobody. She wandered the streets of Lagos, the same streets where she had once been admired, now looking like a ghost of her former self. She barely recognized the woman in the reflections of the shop windows. Her once flawless skin looked dull. Her designer wigs were gone, replaced with her natural hair, unkempt and exposed. She walked past restaurants where she used to dine, past stores where she used to shop, her stomach twisting with hunger. For the first time in her life, she knew what it meant to suffer. Days turned into weeks. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She started begging, swallowing her pride, knocking on doors of people she once called friends. They laughed in her face. Some pretended not to know her. Some reminded her of her own cruelty, of how she had once mocked those beneath her. She had stepped on too many people on her way up, and now on her way down, no one was willing to catch her. One evening, weak and desperate, she stood outside a luxury hotel, watching as expensive cars pulled in, wealthy people stepping out in clothes she once owned, living the life she once had. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, her throat dry from thirst. She reached out to a passing businessman, her voice shaking. "Please, can you spare something for food?" The man barely glanced at her, shaking his head as he walked past. Then another car pulled up. A sleek black Bentley, the kind of car only the ultra-rich owned. A driver stepped out and opened the back door. And then Trish's world froze. A young man stepped out, tall, confident, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. He had presence, power, the kind of aura that only belonged to those born into wealth. But that wasn't what made her stare. It was the birthmark on his neck. A mark she had seen before. On a newborn she had left to die. Her breath caught in her throat, her vision blurred, her entire body trembling. It couldn't be. But it was. Nathaniel Williams, the son of the woman she had ignored, the baby she had abandoned, was standing before her. A man now, powerful and untouchable, living the life she had once thrown away. Trish's world spun as she stared at the young man who had just stepped out of the Bentley. The sleek car, the expensive suit, the aura of confidence. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, but it was the birthmark on his neck that shattered her completely. She had seen that mark before. She had given birth to that mark. Her chest tightened. Her breath came in short, rapid gasps. This isn't real. This isn't possible. But it was real. And it was possible. The boy she had abandoned in the trash bin, the child she had cast aside like garbage, now stood before her, tall and strong with the presence of a king. She barely recognized him, but her blood recognized him. Her soul recognized him. Nathaniel was talking to someone, giving a small nod before walking towards the entrance of the hotel. Trish's mind screamed for her to move, to call out to him, to do something. But her body refused to listen. She was frozen, trapped in the storm of her own making. Then, as if sensing something, he turned. His eyes met hers. For a moment there was nothing. No recognition. No flicker of familiarity. Just a rich young man looking at a homeless woman. Trish's lips trembled. Her throat burned. She wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Then Nathaniel's gaze flickered with something, curiosity, maybe even pity. He glanced at her ragged clothes, her sunken eyes, the desperation carved into her face. She could see the slight furrow in his brow, as if he was trying to place where he had seen her before. He took a small step forward. Trisha panicked. She turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement, her vision blurred by tears. What was she running from? Him? Herself? The truth? He didn't know. All she knew was that she had to get away. She ran until she reached the abandoned building she had been sleeping in for the past few weeks. Her chest heaved as she collapsed onto the cold floor, her hands clutching at her head. It was him. There was no doubt about it. But how? How had he survived? How had he ended up in the hands of one of the richest women in Lagos? Fate was cruel, twisting her sins into something she could no longer escape. Memories flooded her. The cold night, the trash bin, the weak cries. The moment she had convinced herself that the child would simply disappear. But he hadn't disappeared. He had grown into everything she had wanted for herself. Trisha spent the next few days in a haze, unable to think clearly. She wandered the streets, lost in the past, haunted by what she had seen. She wanted to talk to him. She wanted to tell him the truth. But what would she say? "Hello, I'm your mother. The woman who threw you away." He would hate her. He would despise her. And he had every right to. Yet the pull inside her wouldn't let her rest. She needed to see him again. She needed to get close, even if she never revealed the truth. So she waited. She learned his routine. Where he went. What time he left his office. She followed from a distance, careful not to be seen. She watched as he moved through the world with ease, with power. The same world that had rejected her now bowed before him. And it was all because of her mistake. One evening she saw him walking towards his car alone. Her heart pounded. This was her chance. She forced herself forward, her steps hesitant but determined. When she was close enough she spoke. "Please. I need your help." Nathaniel paused, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable. "What do you need?" Her lips trembled. She had prepared a lie, a simple plea for money, anything to keep him talking. But standing in front of him, looking into his face, the face of a child she had abandoned but never truly forgotten, she couldn't do it. Tears welled in her eyes. He had to tell him. I need to talk to you, she whispered. It's important. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. I don't know you. The words stabbed her in the chest. No, you don't, she admitted. But I know you. He frowned, glancing at his watch. He was going to walk away. Panic surged inside her. She had to say something before she lost him again. You have a birthmark on your neck, she blurted. Nathaniel's expression changed instantly. A flash of shock, then confusion, then something deeper. How do you know that? He asked, his voice cautious. Trisha took a shaky breath. Because I gave birth to you. Silence. A deep, suffocating silence that stretched between them. Nathaniel stared at her, his face blank. Then a cold, humorless chuckle escaped his lips. You must be insane, he said. Or desperate. Trisha's hands trembled. I'm telling the truth. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. I was raised by Mrs. Mary Williams. I have no mother except for her. Trisha felt the words like a slap. She raised you, she said softly, but she didn't give birth to you. Nathaniel's eyes darkened. You expect me to believe that the woman who saved my life isn't my real mother and you, some woman off the streets, are? Tears spilled down Trisha's cheeks. I'm not asking you to believe me. I need you to know the truth. Nathaniel's face hardened. And what do you want? Money? Sympathy? Trisha swallowed the lump in her throat. No. I don't care, Nathaniel cut in. Whoever you are, whatever you think you know, it means nothing to me. His words crushed her. Nathaniel took a step back. Do not follow me again. And just like that he walked away. Trisha stood there, frozen, the reality of her actions crashing over her. She had abandoned him once. Now he had abandoned her. And this time there was no undoing it. Trisha stood frozen as Nathaniel disappeared into his sleek black Bentley, the sound of the car engine humming like a final goodbye. The pain in her chest felt like a sharp knife, twisting deeper with every second that passed. She had feared this moment, feared that he would reject her, but the way he had looked at her, with disgust, with cold indifference, it shattered whatever hope she had carried. She had abandoned him first. Now he had abandoned her. Her knees buckled and she stumbled back, pressing herself against the cold concrete wall of the alley. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. She had lost him forever. For the next few days, Trisha wandered the streets in a daze. She barely ate. She barely slept. Her mind kept replaying his words. Whoever you are, whatever you think you know, it means nothing to me. She had thrown him away like trash, and now he had discarded her in the same way. It was justice. It was karma. And yet it hurt more than anything she had ever felt. She needed to see him again. Maybe if she explained everything properly, if she begged, if she told him how much she regretted it, he would listen. She didn't expect forgiveness, she didn't even deserve it, but she needed him to know that she wasn't heartless. That she had suffered too. One evening she stood outside his office building watching. Nathaniel stepped out, dressed in another expensive suit, his posture perfect, his aura untouchable. A few business associates walked beside him, talking and laughing. He had a powerful presence, a confidence that made people gravitate toward him. He looked so much like her. She took a step forward, but before she could call his name, another car pulled up. The door opened and Mrs. Mary stepped out. Trisha's breath hitched. Even after all these years she recognized her instantly. The woman who had raised the son she abandoned. Mrs. Mary's presence was commanding, effortlessly elegant in her designer gown, her posture regal. When Nathaniel saw her, his face softened in a way that made Trisha's heart ache. He embraced her, his mother. Not her. Trisha felt her body tremble. That should have been her. She should have been the one to watch him grow, to celebrate his successes, to hold him with pride. But she had thrown away the right to be his mother the night she left him in the trash. Mrs. Mary whispered something to Nathaniel and he smiled. They laughed together, stepping into the car like a perfect family. Trisha's legs felt weak as she watched them drive away. The truth hit her harder than it ever had before. Nathaniel wasn't her son anymore. He never would be. He belonged to Mrs. Mary, the woman who had saved him, who had given him everything she had thrown away. And she She was nothing to him. That night, Tricia sat alone in the corner of a small, abandoned building, staring at her hands. For the first time she truly saw herself. She had spent her entire life chasing vanity, luxury, empty fame. She had lived selfishly and in the end she had nothing. No money. No friends. No family. No son. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. The world had once been at her feet and now she was begging for scraps. Her choices had led her here. She had no one to blame but herself. The next morning she made a decision. She wouldn't chase after Nathaniel anymore. She wouldn't beg him to see her, to acknowledge her, to give her another chance. She had already failed him once. She wouldn't ruin his life again. For the first time in her life she accepted the consequences of her actions. She disappeared from his world, leaving nothing behind but a memory that he would likely forget. Nathaniel never saw her again. And for the rest of her life she carried the weight of what she had done. The weight of a mother who had abandoned her child. And lost him forever.